NATO makes a fresh push for Ukraine's membership while Russia issues a nuclear warning to the West, highlighting the ever-growing divide between major global powers. NATO's new Secretary General singles out Russia and then China for enabling the war in Ukraine. Meanwhile, Moscow says it can retaliate with nuclear weapons if attacked with conventional ones. Plus, with conflict escalating in the Middle East, are we nearing a potentially nuclear global conflict? I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is the Newsmakers. Right now, the world feels on edge as conflicts escalate dangerously in the Middle East and in Europe. While Israel vows retaliation for Iranian missile strikes, Russia is warning it will deploy nuclear weapons if any more conventional weapons are used against it. Yet NATO's new chief, Mark Rutte, says support for Kiev must be a priority. And that, of course, means the military support that Russia is warning against. Now, Rutte also called out China for being a decisive enabler of President Putin. While he says there should be implications for that, he didn't specify what. Still, the provocative language and military action on all fronts does not bode well for maintaining global peace. Here's a look.
The former Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte has officially taken command of NATO, stepping in as Secretary General during a time of unprecedented tension. He vows to uphold the alliance's commitment to increasing defence spending and steadfastly supports Ukraine's NATO membership aspirations.
Supporting Ukraine is the right thing to do. And it is also an investment in our own security. Because an independent and democratic Ukraine is vital for peace and stability in Europe. And the cost of supporting Ukraine is far, far lower than the cost we would face if we allow Putin to get his way.
Ukraine's NATO membership has long been a red line for Russia's President Vladimir Putin. He's vehemently opposed Ukraine joining the alliance, viewing it as a direct threat to Russian influence in the region. Last week, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky visited the United States to garner support for his so-called victory plan. Although exact details of the plan have not yet been made public, what is known is that Ukraine is pushing to become a member of the alliance and have permission to use longer-range NATO weapons to strike targets deep within Russian territory. But President Putin was quick to react and escalated his nuclear rhetoric.
The updated version of the document proposes that aggression against Russia by any non-nuclear weapon state, but with the participation or support of a nuclear weapon state, should be regarded as a joint attack on the Russian Federation. The conditions for Russia's transition to the use of nuclear weapons are also clearly defined. We will consider such a possibility as soon as we receive reliable information about a massive launch of aerospace attack means and their crossing of our state border, meaning strategic or tactical aircraft, cruise missiles, drones, hypersonic missiles, and other aircraft.
Military analysts note that Putin's nuclear options could include low-yield tactical strikes, which would be aimed at deterring NATO involvement while sending a stark message. Zelensky's chief of staff, Andriy Yermak, dismissed the new nuclear doctrine, saying,
Russia no longer has any instruments to intimidate the world apart from nuclear blackmail. These instruments will not work.
Ukraine remains resolute, dismissing Russia's threats as ineffective intimidation. Yet both sides are preparing for renewed conflict. Russia has made incremental gains in the Donbas region, while Ukraine has captured significant territory in Russia's Kursk province. With new leadership in NATO and escalating rhetoric from Moscow, the stakes in Ukraine continue to rise, prompting growing concerns of the imminent threat of nuclear confrontation.
So are we nearing the conditions that led to global conflict before? And what, if anything, can be done to de-escalate? Well, joining me now to debate that and more are from London, research affiliate at Cambridge University's Center for the Study of Existential Risk and contributor to NATO Watch, Paul Ingram, and from Moscow, the deputy foreign editor at Komsomolskaya Pravda daily newspaper, Dmitry Babich. Thanks both so much for being with me. Paul, let's start with you, and we'll start with Russia, NATO, and Ukraine. Even if Ukraine does not ultimately join the alliance, simply, making that pledge publicly again, it further agitates an already agitated Russia. Now, I know you've said NATO has no real intention of letting Ukraine join. How do you figure, first of all, and what's the point then of Rutte saying that if it's not the case?
I think Rutte is making a play for this general principle that Ukraine has the right to self-determination and the right to join NATO when the conditions are right. Of course, the conditions are many years away, but he's playing to the gallery, and I think that's very dangerous at this point in time when we need to be de-escalating this conflict and moving towards a resolution. I think his statement as he takes over the alliance is concerning, but it's more of the same. We've seen this from Stoltenberg, his predecessor, and from the leaderships of NATO. They seem to be falling over each other to stand by Ukraine. This seems to be popular within publics. I think it's deeply worrying.
Dmitry, do you believe it's deeply worrying, and can it backfire?
I think it can backfire, and I agree with you. I see no point in stressing this right now. However, I think the main problem is not so much the persons. The main problem is the narrative, the mainstream narrative. If before I personally was afraid of radical narrative on both sides, now I'm afraid the mainstream narrative is terrible, both in the West and in Russia. And Rutte, as the new Secretary General of NATO, what he said in his speech was very much the mainstream, but it sounds terrible. It sounds detached from reality, like him saying that his predecessor, Jens Stoltenberg, did a great job. Jens, you did a great job. And Jens Stoltenberg, passing the powers to Rutte, said that 10 years ago, when I took over NATO, there could be no talk of NATO missiles, NATO arms being transferred to Ukraine. And see where we are now. Well, I think it's terrible that we are there now. It's terrible that Mr. Rutte, in his speech, basically says that the defense of Ukraine cannot stop at the borders, which is a hint encouraging NATO countries to let Ukraine strike deep into Russia. Then he kind of stepped back, saving his own skin, I'm sorry, saying that the final decision is with NATO members. But that's terrible what's going on. And the same can be said about Russian mainstream narrative. I think Rutte is not a villain, to my mind. He's just a person who believes the mainstream Western narrative, just like the person who tried to kill President Trump, former President Trump, Ryan Root. If you look at his statements, if you look at his biography, he just believed the mainstream narrative, which depicted Trump as a huge villain who really needs to be killed. I mean, if Trump had been all the things that he was called in the European media, I would say that a person trying to assassinate him is probably a hero. The reality is that Trump is a very bad person. To my mind, he is a nouveau riche and a really unpleasant American nationalist.
Okay.
But the demonization is terrible on both sides.
Yeah, and I mean, on the Russian side, though, Dmitry, it is very
Absolutely
disturbing to have Russia threaten the use of nuclear weapons. There are those that say Putin is bluffing, but again, at a time this sensitive, with so much conflict on the table and such dangerous escalations, this constant incremental movement toward the worst-case scenario, why is Russia doing that?
Well, if you look at Russian actions, we are never the first to use terrible actions and terrible weapons. It's usually just a response. And what Putin has been doing in the last 2 years after the war escalated. The war actually started, of course, in 2014. It actually started in 2013 because the so-called peaceful protests at the Maidan were so violent. You know, there were 38 policemen killed. It was actually a war in the middle of Kiev. So the war escalated in 2022, and Putin started mentioning Russian nuclear weapons. He talks constantly about these exercises. But for example, look what Israel has done with pages. I think this attack by pages, you know, this weaponization of household devices, this is something terrible. It's on the par with chemical weapons and with nuclear weapons. So what I would say, if you want me, I will just finish. What I think really disturbing about Russia is not so much the talk about nuclear weapons. Talk is talk. The narrative has changed. If until 2022 we had a narrative of the West being misunderstanding us, now it's just treacherous Anglo-Saxons, bad Europeans. We didn't start it. The West started demonizing Russians a long earlier, 20 or 30 years earlier. But unfortunately, we followed in the same track, and that's terrible.
But Paul, let me ask you, though, I mean, is the specific threatening of nuclear weapons, does it go beyond the pale? Or can it be kind of compared to any use of weapons, any kind of horrible attack, as Dmitry was describing, you know, the attacks in Lebanon? Or is the nuclear threat different?
I think the nuclear threat is different, primarily because if there were a use of a nuclear weapon, wherever it is, the shock would be huge. And then the next step would be very, very difficult to contain and control, predict. Most of the wargaming that went on in the Cold War meant that when a nuclear weapon were used, the slide into nuclear exchange and the consequence for the world of nuclear exchange is enormous. Now, I'm not defending the use of pagers and walkie-talkies exploding. I think that that is a big escalation, and I'm not going to defend Israel. But what I would say is that when people predict that President Putin will not use nuclear weapons in response to particular escalatory actions, we have to look at Israel and the way in which the Israelis have escalated again and again beyond the expectation of the people in the region.
I want to talk further about that, Paul, so put that on hold, because I do want to get into what's happening in the Middle East region. But first of all, a double-fold question then for you finally on NATO, Russia, Ukraine. Ruta says the cost of supporting Ukraine is far lower than the cost of a victory for what the cost of a victory for Putin would be. First of all, how so? And he also says that China cannot continue to fuel the largest conflict in Europe since World War II without it impacting its interests and reputation. So again, is that more kind of fear-mongering against China? I mean, in what form is he talking about? Is this, again, too much escalatory language?
I think what we are seeing is a lot of signaling and playing to the gallery. So China is not fueling this conflict. China has supplies to Russia in various ways, but it's far from definitive and is not changing the course of this war in the way that the supplies on the other side are. It's a way of trying to imply that China has picked sides and to demonize China, which I think is really problematic, because in the end, China has the potential to play a really critical peacemaking role in this conflict. We have China at the moment taking on the chairmanship of the Nuclear Weapons States Forum, the P5 process, and China is the only state of the five that is not involved directly in this conflict. I think we need to be seeing China as a really potential peacemaking actor in the system on both these conflicts, in Ukraine and in the Middle East.
Yeah, Ruta, though, says China is involved in this conflict. That's what he made pretty clear yesterday, that it is a decisive enabler of Putin.
And that is a lie. China is not a decisive enabler. China, it has a relationship with Russia, but by making those sorts of statements, it is neutralizing the possibility of having a genuinely neutral, powerful state playing a role that could be constructive, rather than the role that many states outside the conflict are playing at the moment. We desperately need bridge builders here, and China is pretty much the only powerful potential bridge builder that we have in the world today. So efforts to try and tarnish China's reputation before they've even started, I think, is really problematic.
Okay. Let me move on with Dmitry then to what is happening now between Israel, Gaza, Lebanon, Iran, and this very frightening escalation we've seen. How does Russia view what is happening now in the Middle East?
Well, first, I would like to agree with what Paul has just said. I think that it's very irresponsible on the part of Rutte to insult China, because to call China an enabler of Russia, knowing what Rutte thinks about Russia, is of course an insult. In a translation, it means you are enabling an aggressor. But that's irresponsible. That's a kind of irresponsible foreign policy that we have from Nato, unfortunately, from the European Union especially, and from the United States. A few years ago, a diplomat who would make such a statement antagonizing a very important country, that diplomat would be fired in a second. Now, if you don't go against the ideology of the West, if you don't say something anti-ultra-liberal, you stay with your job despite tremendous harm that you could be doing. Coming back to Gaza and Israel, Russia always tried to mediate because we have our people in Israel, actually more than 1 million of them. We have a lot of friends, and we have a lot of our people in Arab countries. I was calling Lebanon yesterday because people suffered there. There are 20,000 Russian women there who are married to Lebanese. And I talked to a few of them, and that's astounding what I heard. So, of course, we don't want this conflict to escalate. But so far, it looks like Mr. Netanyahu is really out of control. The usual Russian narrative is that United States is forcing Israel, is like using Israel as a proxy. I think that's not true. If you look, it's not clear who manipulates whom. Mr. Netanyahu, by his aggressive actions, is actually dragging the United States into a much wider conflict than the United States expected. The same story with Zelensky. If you look, there is a lot of similarities between Zelensky and Netanyahu. Both were supposed to be allies of the United States, but both act in such ways that they force the West to get into a dangerous confrontation with Russia, with the Arab world, with Iran,
Let me ask,
and possibly in future with China.
Paul, that's a very interesting take that I haven't heard before, comparing Netanyahu and Zelensky. I mean, would you agree that there are those similarities?
There are some similarities in these conflicts, and I think that we can use different frames to make sense of these challenges. But I would say that we need to look at both of these and other conflicts with a greater degree of consistency, because we tend to pick sides before conflicts even start, and then interpret that conflict from the side that we've picked. Right. And that's problematic. We need to be working towards a much more clear-eyed view of these conflicts, and to recognise that those that engage in escalation, those that try to provoke their opponents into responses are deeply irresponsible, and we should not be supporting them.
Okay, I mean, looking at that though, from the more cynical perspective and analysts that we've heard from, there's the take out there that Russia actually sees what's happening in the Middle East as a welcome distraction, because to put it cynically, it leaves the U.S. and the West even more overwhelmed, in order to kind of take their eyes further off Ukraine and feeling that it's a battle that they can't fight any further. What do you make of that?
Well, when your back is up against the wall, then you are going to see these things in cynical ways. But I do think, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if there are those within Moscow who do see it that way. But I also think that we need to be searching out the peacemakers here. And as I was saying earlier, I think Beijing is a real opportunity to step up. If I were an analyst advising the Chinese government today, I would say here is an opportunity to play a leadership role, to demonstrate to the majority world that the time has come for China to step into a global leadership and not necessarily replace the United States, but to demonstrate that China can do peacemaking so much more effectively than Washington can today.
Okay. Dmitry, you were very human in your analysis, saying that Russia doesn't want this conflict to escalate in the Middle East because, for example, you said there are 20,000 Russian citizens, Russian women living in Lebanon right now that you're concerned about. However, sometimes leaders don't prove as humanistic in their strategizing as we'd like them to. So when you hear that analysis that Russia cynically welcomes the conflict in the Middle East because it undermines the US and the West, what do you say to that?
Well, first, I would say that, of course, there are some political analysts in Russia, and there are, of course, a lot of just citizens who may see it this way. And we hear it on our radio, we read it in the newspapers. Different views are expressed in Russia, surprised as you may see, as you may be about it. But it's certainly not the government policy. And I can cite you some facts. For example, in 2015, Russia did everything to have this JCPOA, this nuclear deal, signed between Iran and the other powers. And a lot of people asked at the time in Russia, they asked our foreign minister Lavrov, okay, that means Iran will be selling its oil at the world market. So Iran will be our competitor. We're going to lose money. What are you doing? And Lavrov said, we're not here only about the money. And that was 2015. The war in Ukraine already started and relations with the West were terrible. So, the Russian government has been changing in the last few years. And of course, the war is a period when it changes for the worse. But generally speaking, I would not view Russian government as villains. And just factually speaking, how could we produce the horror which is now going on in the Middle East? We have no way to...
Not produce it. The argument was that they're reveling in it. Because
the attitude, governments are usually very reserved about their attitudes. If you look at the statements from our foreign ministry, from our officials, they are normal. People may be saying all sorts of terrible things, unfortunately. I'm used to that as a journalist. We had no role in making this horror happen. Okay. And believe me, the huge majority of people wanted to end in Russia.
Let me ask Paul then a final question. Hopefully I have time to get both of you in for this. But, Paul, it actually pained me to write the opener for this program because I can't believe we're asking if a global nuclear conflict could even be in the cards. But would it be naive not to? Are we nearing the conditions that led to world wars before?
So it would be naive to predict that leaders would never contemplate the use of nuclear weapons. I think that is complacent, and I think that there are too many people in the West who seem to think that President Putin has made threats and not delivered in the past, and so therefore he will not deliver in the future. I think that that's dangerous thinking. And I think that it's really important that we treat this conflict with the seriousness that it demands, which is to step in the opposite direction of escalation. And that is not just about the risk of nuclear war. It's also about what is responsible in terms of building the capacity for the international community to actually start cooperating together, because we have to do so. Climate change is hitting us. There's all sorts of challenges and disruptive influences coming here beyond the scope of great power conflict. Great
Right.
powers must be collaborating. If we don't collaborate, there is very little future for our species, whether we blow ourselves up with nuclear weapons or burn ourselves up from
Okay.
climate change.
Dmitry, just 1 minute quickly. How hopeful are you that, as you think, President Putin wouldn't be pushed to use nuclear weapons and escalate this into a global conflict, potentially?
I think Putin has proven during his tenure that he doesn't want to die and he doesn't want the world to be destroyed. He is a normal human being. Demonizing him is dangerous. You talked about world wars. It will be just 30 seconds from me. You know, the First World War started because French and the Germans and the British and the Russians were demonizing each other ethnically. The Second World War happened because Stalin said that, oh, you know, workers in Finland have to be liberated, and a number of anti-communist leaders in the West demonized communists. The Third World War may start because there is a way now in the Western media to demonize leaders, which the West doesn't like. The usual narrative is we have to start the war because that person in power in Iraq, in Russia, in China, he's crazy, he's so dangerous, we have to take him out. And then the war starts like it happened in Iraq, like it happened in many other places. So we need to avoid this if we learn from the experience.
That will have to be the final word. Thank you both so much for being with us on this edition of the Newsmakers. Greatly appreciated. Thanks to our viewers for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.